The Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank that promotes debate and dialogue on public policy issues. And within the IEA, we have 6 programs or 6 policy areas. And one of those policy areas is the Public Finance Management Program, which will be hosting this webinar. And one of the things that we do at within the program is to analyze the budget every year. And obviously, the main objective of that is not only to influence budget proposals, but also for public education. And so today we just want to share some insights and highlights of our analysis. And to help me do that is my colleagues within the PFM program. So we have 4 speakers. So the way we've split this, we'll split this into 4 areas. So we'll have the first speaker, Noah Omalwa, who will take us through the macro context of the budget, or the context underpinning the budget 2025-2026. And it will also take us through an overview of the entire budget. After taking us through an understanding of the context, he will share what the overview of the budget is in terms of the revenue side, just the distribution of the entire budget and the financing aspect. But to share the details, of course, of this budget in terms of breaking it down further, we will have both Faith and Raphael in that order. And so Faith will focus more on the consolidated fund services, and Raphael will follow thereafter with, he will share highlights of the wage bill and sectoral analysis. So these highlights will focus more on the key budget items or tickets, if you like. And after Raphael's presentation, then Melody will conclude by taking us through, of course, the focus that will precede Melody's is obviously where the money is going. And so Melody's focus or presentation will be where the money is coming from. So the financing aspect, again, details. Whereas Noah will share some highlights, Melody will share details of that. And in all this, one of the things that they will be touching on is the implication of these proposals to fiscal consolidation. So government's focus or aim is to ensure that this budget is prepared in such a way that it would reduce the deficit progressively to about 3% in the medium term as a ratio of GDP. So in the analysis, as they are sharing all this, they'll mention where we are. I mean, the implication of these proposals towards that progressive target to fiscal consolidation plan. Yeah. So yes. So without further ado, we basically, before I invite them, they will take about 40 minutes, and of course, thereafter we will open it up for Q&A that will take about 30 minutes, and then conclude after that. So as the presentation goes on, please, you can use the chat box to share whatever comments that you have, but of course we'll have that opportunity for people to ask questions, whether verbally or through the chat box. So without further ado, Noah, karibu sana. And so I think I will not necessarily stop. So the presentation will go on seamlessly. So after Noah is done, it will follow like that, Faith and so on. So Noah, karibu.
Yeah, thank you. I will cover the macroeconomic context and then provide a brief overview of the budget. Then my colleague, Faith, will take us through the consolidated fund services, what is otherwise called non-discretionary part of the budget. Then my colleague Raphael, will take us through the wage bill and also highlight the sectorial distribution of the budget across the sectors. And then lastly, my colleague Melody will take us through the financing bit of the budget and also briefly look at the projections and assess whether it is realistic or not. Yeah. So to start us off, this budget, the 2025-2026 budget, is being prepared under depressed economic performance. As you know, last year, that is 2024, the economy grew by 4.7%. Now, when you look at the start of the budget for 2024, it had been projected that it will grow by around 5.2. So by growing at 4.7, that means it's a shock to the economy. And partly this is explained by the global tensions, the Ukraine-Russia war, Israeli conflict, and all this. So Kenya imports a lot of key imports, for example, wheat, rice, and oil. So all these commodities are affected by these geopolitical tensions. Now, in this budget, it initially Treasury had projected around it that the economy will grow by around 5.2%. But ongoing Gen Z riots and tensions within the economy have led to reduced forecast. You see institutions like IMF forecasting that the economy will just grow at around 4.8 this year, 4.8. So 4.8 and 4.7 last year, it means that the economy is growing below the medium-term average. It has been growing at around 5.2 when you do the average for the last five years. So it's likely to grow below the average, yeah. And our key sectors are not performing very well. For example, manufacturing, as a share of, in terms of contribution to GDP, it's less than 10%. It's around 7.7% of GDP. So that is very low, and partly it was affected by the high cost in terms of access to credit. Yeah. So we have seen some effort by CBK to reduce the CBR rate, the central bank rate. And we think that this will help in terms of improving the access to credit by the private sector, which is good for the economy. So what needs to be done is that CBK should also focus on inflation. We've seen inflation rising for the last 3 months. Currently is around 3.8, and it's likely to rise. So there's need to manage inflation as well. Yeah. Then allow me to take you through the overview of the budget. So what I'm presenting here is what is called the budget outturn. The budget outturn shows the revenue bit of the budget, the expenditure side, and then the deficit. Yeah, so these are the main areas. That is A, B, and F. A, B, and F. Yeah. So for A, that is revenue. Total revenue in 2025-26 is 3.3 trillion, compared to the total expenditure. Global expenditure is 5.08. When you add redemption, that is repayment on the principal part of the loan that we borrowed in the previous period. So that brings us to a deficit of 1.7. So you can realize that National Treasury declared a budget of 4.2. 4.29 trillion. That is because National Treasury did not include redemption. Yeah, their reasoning is that redemption was already accounted for in the previous period. And so they avoid double counting. Yeah, but our reasoning here is if you want to capture total expenses, payment of the loans that are due, the principal part of the loans that are due is part of the expenses for this year, 2025, 2026. And so we think that to account for all the expenses, we need to add to reflect that. And so that's why we are working with a budget of 5.089. So this has an implication on the deficit. Our deficit works to 1.7 trillion, but National Treasury, their deficit is 0.922 trillion. Yeah. So when you look at the change in total revenue, the change is positive. It is expected to grow by 8%. Global expenditure is expected to grow by 3.5. Yeah, and deficit, the fiscal deficit is expected to reduce actually by 4.2. That is row F, 4.2%. So it means that there is progress towards fiscal consolidation. That is the medium-term goal by the government through the National Treasury to reduce the debt burden. So they term it as a fiscal consolidation plan. In the medium term, it is aimed to be not more than 3%, not more than negative 3% of GDP. Yeah. Now, when we work with our figures, 1.7 trillion, the deficit as a share of GDP is minus 8.7% of GDP. Yeah. On per capita basis, the total expenditure is 94,000. That is every person in Kenya on average. The budget, the expenditure is 94.6 thousand. The revenue is 63.7. Sorry, 63,745. Yeah, which means the deficit is 32 minus 32,000 per capita. Yeah. Now, let me briefly talk about discretionary and non-discretionary. So the budget, you can view the budget in terms of which is the flexible part or mandatory part of the budget versus which one is non-mandatory. Yeah. So the mandatory part, we are calling it non-discretionary. Mandatory means that the government does not have a choice other than to pay this obligation, to meet this obligation as it falls due. This is because it is outlined in the Constitution that the payment of the debt and these statutory deductions like subscription to IMF and all this, they are mandatory. That's why, I mean, yes. So if it is mandatory, it means that it reduces the flexibility of the budget. Yeah. And in total, in quantum, it is 2.1 trillion. That is the whole CFS, which constitutes the non-discretionary, is 2.1 trillion. Now, when you compare with discretionary, is around, discretionary is 2.9. 2.9 discretionary and 2.1 trillion non-discretionary. Yes. So as a share, this is 2025. So as a share, in terms of proportion, the non-discretionary is 42%. Yeah, 42%. So the other one is now 58%. So 42%, what that means is that if you have 100 shilling, 42 shilling out of that, you set it aside for this mandatory expenditure. So the flexibility really reduces. Now, for non-discretionary, the mandatory, the biggest part that is really driving is the interest, the payment for the interest on the loans that have fallen due. So, which means the interest part of the loans is rising really sharply. Yeah, and that is a concern. And even in the medium-term debt management strategy, this is a policy document prepared by the National Treasury and approved by the National Assembly. It gives a short-term and medium-term view in terms of management of our debt. Specifically, it has highlighted the risks in terms of financing, the financing risk of our debt due to the high interest rate. Then another risk include the forex. Yeah. Then that is 51%. Redemption is 38%. Now over to discretionary. The executive takes the biggest chunk at a 3, which is reasonable or can be understood. Now for the county government, in combined, the share is 14%. That is 405 equitable share, which constitutes 14%. Parliament, the total is 48 billion. Judiciary is 28 billion. Yeah, so this chart just shows the evolution in terms of proportional allocations for the discretionary across the 3 years. So as I said, the total discretionary is 2.9 trillion and is coming from 2.6 trillion in 2023-24. So the national executive has really maintained, the key message here we can see is that the national executive, the national government part, has really maintained its proportion at 3%. But what you can see is that the county government share has been declining. So the allocation is 405 billion compared to 387 billion last period. While the proportion in the last period was higher, 15%, it has since reduced to 14 by 1 percentage point to 14%. Yeah. So CRA had recommended a higher figure, had recommended 417 billion. As IEA, we had recommended around 440, while the Council of Governors and the Senate had recommended around 450. And that's why the different agencies and the National Assembly are not agreeing. That's why this is going into mediation process. Yeah. So I think I'll stop there and allow my colleague Faith to take us through the consolidated fund services.
I'll be taking you through the CFS. As Noah had mentioned earlier, the CFS is basically the non-discretionary part of the government spending. And this is, as you can see from this table, the components include the repayment of debt, that is both the interest and the redemption of the principal, as well as the payment of the pensions and salaries and allowances. And this component of salaries and allowances is basically payment to the constitutional office holders, that is, including the president, the deputy president, the OAG, and control of budget and chairpersons of independent offices, and as well as the constitutional commissions like the CRA, chairperson of the CRA and IEBC. And from our table here, we can see total CFS in nominal term, in actual figures, has been rising up to from 2018, 2019, all the way to 2023, 2024. For the figures for 2024, 25, and the 25, 26 are estimates. So from the current estimates, that is for 25, 2026, they are estimating to spend around 2.1 trillion on discretionary spending. Sorry, non-discretionary spending. And this is reflects a reduction from the previous year from 2.2 trillion. That is a 6% reduction. But in actual figures from 2018, we can see an increase in the same from around 936 billion all the way to 1.9 trillion. That is a significant increase. And what is driving this increase, you can see, is the debt redemption and interest payment. That is the servicing public debt. From the same table, we can see interest payment for the current year is going to be around 1 trillion. That is an increase of 10% from the previous year. And the same has been rising from a payment of 370 billion in 2018 and 2019 up to now, the rate which we project to pay almost 1 trillion shilling. The next big spending of the in CFS is pension, and finally the salaries and allowances item. For pension, we've seen an increase from 80.5 billion in 2018 and 2019 up to 234 billion in the current estimate. And basically, you can see CFS spending is driven by public debt repayment, both the interest and the redemption. In the current year, the reduction stems from the decline in the redemption item from 1 trillion to around 800 billion. And this is because we repaid at the Eurobond that was borrowed in 2014 last year, hence the increase in the repayment redemption amount to 1 trillion. And this year it's going down because we are still paying the redemption, but it's not as high as last year. Noah, please go to the next slide. As we've seen, the interest payment is very high, and this is driven by the growth in the total public debt. As a share of GDP, we can see that debt has been rising over the years to the highest rate of around 72% of GDP in 2023, 2024, 2022, 2023. But it has started declining. That is on the positive side. It's declining, and it's projected to decline to 63.6% in the next financial year. Basically, interest payment is increasing because we are borrowing at very high interest rate. And for example, we can see the composition of debt has changed. In the previous year, we were borrowing more from the external sources. And external sources include concessional loans. But in the recent years, we've increased our borrowing from commercial sources, like borrowing from the commercial sources, such as the Eurobond that we borrowed in the previous financial year. So debt composition is changing from external to domestic sources. For instance, from 2023, our total external debt is more compared to the internal. Sorry, the domestic is more than the external debt. And domestic debt is basically the T-bills and T-bonds, which are borrowed at very high interest rate. As Noah had outlined earlier, our T-bill rate was around 15.7% in the previous years, which is very high. This coupled with the borrowing from from commercial sources. That is we borrowed we floated a new Euro bond at 8% rate, has led to the rise in the interest payment. And for we've paying an interest payment, our bill for interest is at 1 trillion, and our debt stock as at March this year is at 11 trillion. And the same period last year was at 10.4 trillion. When you take the difference, you've seen that we've borrowed around 1 trillion shilling. So we are paying, and at the same time, we are borrowing the same amount. And knowing that we are in the process of implementing the fiscal consolidation agenda, this might not be possible because we are not reducing our debt accumulation. From Treasury, the previous PFM Act for 2023 set our debt threshold at 55% of GDP in net present value, and we've not yet met that threshold. So we are questioning the realization of this agenda. Next slide, please. Here we are looking at our ability to pay. CFS payments are usually made from collected tax. That is the ordinary revenue. And as a percentage of ordinary revenue, we've seen a gradual increase of the same over the years. For instance, in 2019-2020, CFS as a percentage of total ordinary revenue was at 55%. And this has risen to around 81% in 2023-2024, and it's projected to increase to 86% towards the end of this financial year. But in the next financial year, they are projecting a decline of this to 74%. That is out of the 2.8 trillion that we are projecting to collect. CFS we are projecting to spend around 2.1 trillion as CFS, and this amounts to the 74%. Of course, debt repayment constitutes the highest payment, and from when we compare this with our revenues, we've seen the same, an increase of total debt service as a percentage of total ordinary revenue from a rate of around 49%, the lowest in 2019-2020, to around 73% of the same. So we are seeing an increase in the amount of mandatory payments taking up more revenue. And this, as mentioned, will eat into, we have to sacrifice other spending towards other services or other sectors like in education or in development spending. And from the same chart, we can see that interest payments in domestic interest payment takes up the highest payment, followed by domestic debt redemption. Thank you.
Thanks, Noah and Faith, for taking us through the outturn and the mandatory component of the budget. From my end, I will be sharing out the discretionary component that constitute the salaries, operation and maintenance, focusing more on the major component of the budget, that is the wage bill. And what we need to understand is the trends and actually how much as of now is our wage bill as it is in the budget. And one of the things that I need to mention is that wage bill is a major expenditure component, and if not watched carefully, it have got fiscal implications. And of course, this is something that we need to focus on. But in terms of numbers, is that if you look at the consolidated wage bill for this country, I think the wage bill has been rising from the financial year 2013-14 up from a figure of 321 B to around a figure of 1.2 trillion in the financial year 2024-2025. And out of that, if you check the executive budget, not incorporating the county wage bill, the figure for last year, 2024-2025, you compare with 2025-2026, the figure has risen from a figure of 625 up to a figure of 651. That's around 26 billion shillings, translating to around 4.2%. And therefore, it tells you that the wage bill over the years, in nominal terms, has been rising throughout, and it should be a concern to the government of the day. In fact, if you look at the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, the projections are that by the year 2028, our wage bill will be around 1.8 trillion shillings. So that's a concern. Now, going to ratios to check whether are we within the line. No, let's go back. Are we in line with the established benchmark? One of them is the PFM Act. And the PFM provides that our wage bill, in terms of if expressed as a ratio of our ordinary revenue, it should not be more than 35%. But if you look at the trends, like the graph that I have projected there, it tells you that over the years, our wage bill, expressed as a ratio of the ordinary revenue, it has been way being above the 35% that is provided. For example, for the year 2024-2025, our ratio was 45% against what is the benchmark or the PFM target of 35%, and therefore tells us is that we need to work more as a government. The government need to work more towards making sure that we are able to rationalize even issues to do with public hiring, but also more looking at the component of allowances. And I think even in terms of disaggregating the information, we need more information in terms of what goes to the wage component and actually what goes to the salaries. And now let's go to the next component. If we look at the other benchmark of expressing wage bill as a ratio of GDP, the benchmark or the best practice provides that it should not be more than 75%. And on average, our wage bill as a ratio of GDP has been around 9%, meaning that we are not moving toward the although we are moving toward that, it tells us that we still have issues that we need to sort out. And therefore, again, it raises the question of either overstaffing and inefficiencies in the government, but also we need to address the component of governance, so that we reduce issues to do with the leakages, which we are saying that it's actually amongst the things that undermines the public trust in Kenya. And in terms of the implication on one of the things the minister said is that from the month of July, I think the government will be rolling out and trying to make sure that they implement the universal system management system, so that we can be able to monitor our wage bill. Number two is that the government will ensure that Salaries and Remuneration Commission will be able to review the allowances that are given to the public service, and ensure that it is in line with the public sector. Now let's go to the sectors. Now, looking at the sectors, and this one we just provide a highlight, is that what we have done is that we have taken the 10 sectors of the 10 sectors of the government, starting from education, energy, public administration, GJ laws, national security, health, all the way up to GECA. That is general economic and commercial affairs. And the big picture is that if you look at the sector allocations in terms of budget, I think the budget has been rising, and as shown in the table, it has risen from 2.3 trillion shillings up to 2.55 trillion shillings. But in terms of ranking, to see which sector is taking the highest allocation, education sector take an allocation of 28%. That accounts up to 702 billion shillings, followed closely by energy and infrastructure with 21%, around 535 billion shillings. And then public administration and international relations follows that with 13%, 322. But again, looking at the lowest, the lowest in terms of ranking, it is the general economic and commercial affairs. And then number 9 actually is the agricultural, rural and urban development. And we normally know that agriculture is the backbone of the economy. We can see in terms of how the ranking, it's actually one of the lowest during this budget. And in terms of shift, if you look at the shift from you compare last year and this year, the sector which got a positive shift in terms of getting more resources is the energy and infrastructure project. And basically, the priority areas are the Ministry of Road, focusing on road. There will be new roads that will be they are online, and also in terms of maintenance, in terms of making sure that the last mile project is completed. I think there's quite a huge allocation. That's why we are seeing a shift in terms of a positive shift toward that particular component, followed closely by environment protection, water, natural resources at a positive 18%. This one relates to dams and other key infrastructure issues to do with sanitation. And therefore, the reason why we are seeing quite a positive shift toward those two sectors. The lowest in terms of negative shift actually is the Ministry of Ministry of actually Agriculture. And the reason that is provided for that, perhaps the reason is that the reason could be associated with a shift occasioned by the Kenya Livestock Commercialization Project that is supposed to be created across 10 counties, and is supposed to be co-funded by IFAD, but also the county government are also actually in the equation. Now let's go to the next slide. I know there has been a talk about the education sector, and perhaps you could touch on this. And we have seen that there has been a shift in terms of in terms of ranking, education sector is the one which is really in terms of allocation. But in terms of some reduction in allocation, I think the basic education was actually affected to a tune. There was a reduction of around 10.8 billion shillings that has been reduced in terms of allocating that particular ministry. And therefore, I know there are questions around that, and the answers that we are given by the CS during the budget reading in terms of how they are allocating resources toward the education sector. And those are the things that, again, we need to have a look to check to see whether the government is doing the priority is actually doing priorities as per the sector reports. Noah, let's go to the absorptions. Another component that that is important to check is whether the amount that was allocated for the budget was actually spent. And if we check the control of budget reports, it tells us that it paints a picture of where are we in terms of the amount that was allocated for financial year 2023-2024. And what it tells us is that if you look across the 10 sectors, it paints a picture of where, if you look at the recurrent expenditure, the absorption rate almost over 75%, which is and when you look at the recurrent expenditure, we are talking about salaries and operations and maintenance, and therefore those ones in terms of absorption, that's not a problem. But again, if you look in terms of development component, we have issues because most of the sectors, they are not absorbing up to 75% of the resources they are allocated. But the leading sectors is the national security. The reason being that most of their components are recurrent expenditure, followed by the education sector. Again, the components is teachers as the TSE, which is recurrent basically salaries, followed by GGA laws, and then agricultural, rural, and urban development. So across the sectors, yes, there have been an increase in terms of absorption rate, but where you notice lower rates in terms of absorption, but particularly the development component, the question then we need to ask ourselves is, if you look at if you check overall, the question we need to ask ourselves is that, do we have the question of procurement issues? Do we have delayed disbursement to the ministries so that projects are not being implemented or time? Or those are the things that we need actually to check. So thanks, and I hand now to Melody.
Thanks, my colleagues, for the presentations. They have focused on issues of spending, how the budget will be executed and what it will be spent on. My focus will be on how the government will raise the resources for spending. So I'll be breaking down the nitty-gritties on the revenue part and the financing of the deficit. So looking at the overall picture, we see that the government expects to collect 3.32 trillion in terms of total revenue. And then when you add grants to that figure, it comes to 3.369. So we see that the growth in revenue is at 8.3%, but there's a reduction in grants. Basically, with the global geopolitics, we've seen what has happened to USAID funding, and also other nations are significantly reducing their foreign aid to developing countries. So that's why we've seen the reduction in grants from 53 billion to 47 billion. And then when we look at the total revenue, the breakdown, we see that government expects to collect 2.755 trillion in terms of ordinary revenue, and 567 billion in terms of appropriation in aid, meaning that the government is pegging more on more collections on appropriation in aid, which are the fees and services, fees that are charged when a government is offering services. So we see that the 16.5% growth means that government is getting to collect more revenues in terms of fees that the ministries are, fees in terms of the services that the ministries are offering and agencies under the government. So this will have an impact on the service delivery, because if the government expects to collect more, it means that lower income households might be expected to pay more and may not have access to the services that they require as provided by the government. So there's a risk in that of access to service delivery, particularly for the low income households. Then ordinary revenue is mostly the highest share of total revenue, which is about over 80% of the total revenue that the government intends to collect. Looking at the breakdown, as it has always been in the past, income tax and value-added tax are the highest tax heads for the government. Government is estimating to collect 1.35 trillion from income tax in terms of payee and also the corporate income tax. And then for value-added tax, it's expecting to collect 772 billion. And these are also have the highest growth rates at 16% and 11%. And then for the other revenue streams, we have import duty growing by 7.2%, excise duty growing by 7%, and other revenue, which constitutes penalties and forfeitures, fines, sale of goods and services, loan interest receipts. It has the lowest growth at 5.9%, with government expecting to collect 268 billion in the next financial year. So when we look at revenue performance, we have to look at it in terms of how the government has been doing in terms of revenue collection in the past 3 years, so that can give us a clear picture of whether it will achieve its revenue targets for the 2025-2026 budget. So from looking at the past performance from 2022-23 to 2024-25, we realize that the government has never met any of the targets that it set for revenue collection, from income tax to value-added tax. And the only instance where the government met and passed its revenues in 2022-23 under the other revenue component, where it increased by 5.8%. It surpassed its target by 5.8%. It expected to collect 146 billion, but in actual sense, it collected 155. Another important thing to note about these targets, over the years, you've seen the government having several supplementaries after they have passed the budget and it has been appropriated. And what happens in most of the supplementaries, we've seen revision of revenue downwards, raising the issues of budget credibility, because whatever that had been set during when the budget estimates are passed by Parliament, most of the time they are reduced, and these targets are not what that had been initially passed by Parliament. Most of these targets are revised targets that have been revised downwards. So if we are to do an analysis of the actual receipts versus what had been projected in the budget that was passed, I think in all instances, we'll see that the revenue shortfall will be higher than what we see currently. So next slide. So we've seen that most likely that the government will not meet its revenue targets. And then we've also seen from the budget outturn that there's a projected fiscal deficit of about 1.7 trillion. And the government targets to raise 922 billion in terms of financing. The net external financing is around 31% of 922 billion, coming to 287, and the net domestic financing is 635. But since our deficit is at 1.7 trillion, there's a financing gap of 804 billion, which is the redemption amount that the government has not factored in when it comes to its revenue and financing projections. So yeah, thanks, and I hand it over back to John.
So they've taken us through some insights actually, and highlights of our IEA's analysis of the budget for 2025-2026. And at least from the insight, I believe you have a clear picture of the breakdown of the anticipated budget for 20. In terms of the expenditure side, the two big budget expenditure items, and obviously the things that drive those two big expenditure items as the consolidated fund services, which is the non-discretionary component of the budget, and obviously the wage bill, which actually is can be termed as a de facto non-discretionary expenditure item. And obviously the implication of those in the realization of Kenya's fiscal consolidation agenda. And then obviously Raphael has also taken us through a breakdown of the sector analysis, the shares, and this, and we had a clear picture of the sectoral shift for 2026, 25, 26 relative to the previous year. I am not sure whether they mentioned whether this was in line with the Kenya's the current administration's better as well as the medium-term policy plan. And then obviously Melody concluded with the financing component, just taking us through the realism of the revenues that are projected to be generated, and actually also the implication of this in regard to fiscal consolidation. Okay, so with that short attempt to summarize the presentation by our four speakers, I will now open it up for questions, comments. I see a few in the chat box, but let me start with, I'll give an opportunity to maybe three. Do we have any questions from our participants? Feel free to either to raise your hand, and I will then allow you to ask your questions, or pause your or make your comment. So let's start with Caroline. Please unmute yourself. Just introduce yourself quickly and pose your questions. Then you can also mention who you like to direct that question to of the four speakers. Caroline?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Caroline Haswa. I'm an advocate, and I'm happy to learn something about finance. My question, I may not know the speaker because I joined in halfway.
Okay.
The speakers, their names, but my comment goes to the area where you have talked about non-discretionary, and the area where we have been told revenue raising performance. On non-discretionary, when you take a loan as a country and you don't follow the law of the country, why does it become non-discretionary when it has not obeyed the rules of financing? How can we embed rule of law in budget financing, especially where you are using collateral of the country, be it the fuel levy, be it our land, be it whatever it is? That is the first one. The second one goes to what is how come we have a deficit every year and our money in the pocket is not growing, and we are not able to budget within our means? Because my view is that the moment you know you have 10 children and you only have one gorogoro food, you will decide for them in the morning to take porridge, and maybe ugali is only once in a day. As finance economics, what is it that we always get wrong? Because there seems to be too much money in this country, but going all to the wrong things. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. So Noah and Faith, I believe you captured that question.
Yes.
Okay, any other, maybe a second one? So two other opportunities, then you can go to the chat box. So of course we'll have a first round, and then we'll see, given the time that we have, whether we move to a second round. Yeah. Do you have any other question from our participants? I guess as they're warming up, I can read. So there are two questions from Professor Rather. Let's see, where is it? She's a professor at the University of Nairobi, and I think also an IEA member. So Professor Rather had, so the two that she posted on the chat box, one was actually she wanted to know what the threshold is. I responded to that. But Faith, if you want to speak more to that, please feel free. But then she had a follow-up question. So the question is, compared to other countries like Vietnam and Sri Lanka, what is comparative education on GDP? And then moving on, we have David Otieno. So David Otieno's question Of course, if the query is not clear, then I mean, I can ask them to just clarify or expound on the queries. But basically, the revenue elasticity to GDP growth rate in T+1 has been estimated at 1.4 for Kenya. Would you agree that for the first time in a long time, the 2025-26 revenue growth rate of 8% is not inflated? I'm not sure whether the query is clear.
Yeah, I think it's clear.
It's clear. Okay, that's fine. So again, Noah and Melody, you can take note of that. Then there's another one from Radha again. So of course, maybe Melody, you can weigh in on this. She's posted here that, but income tax projected to grow at 15%, not realistic. So basically, she's asking about the realistic projections of income tax. And then Caroline, I'm not sure whether it's the same Caroline. So she's posing here. Her question is, as economists, what is wrong that we budget? Money is used to wrong and non-key recurrent, and we just move on. Is there no remedy through budgeting? How can someone project a growth rate when Kenya is living below the poverty line, is increasing, and the purchasing power lowered and constrained? And let's see, do I post this too? Yeah, I mean, this can be open to any of our four speakers. So, so I believe my four colleagues have captured these questions. So what I will do, let's start with Noah. I guess most of those were related to issues of debt, and then the GDP one. So Noah, just answer to the ones that you're able, and then we'll move on to Faith, then Melody, and then Raphael, if you have anything else to add. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, thank you, Caroline. You asked how Kenya can embed the rule of law. And then the second question is, how come we have the deficit every year and we are not able to budget within our means? Yeah, your observation is correct, actually. When you look at, and these issues have well been elaborated or highlighted through the oversight reports. So we have two main institutions that frequently produce these oversight reports. One is the Office of the Auditor General. It assesses the implementation of the budgets, reviews the implementation of the budget, both at the county level and at the national level, and even the key agencies. And issues where we have breaches, where we have misappropriation of funds, are usually highlighted. So the OAG, Office of the Auditor General, reports to Parliament. So these reports are submitted to Parliament. One key weakness, actually, that specifically they are reported to the National Assembly. So one key weakness that we have seen is that we have there's a very slow, the National Assembly has been very slow in terms of acting upon these reports. So, I mean, another institution actually is the Office of the Controller of Budget. So the Office of the Controller of Budget produces several reports. One key report is called Budget Implementation and Review Report. So here it just looks at how the budget was implemented, looks at the performance indicators, for example, on budget efficiency, the absorption rate, that is what was spent actually vis-a-vis what had been planned, and also looks at the utilization rate, that is what was spent vis-a-vis the available amount. So one of the key issues, for example, or impediments that have been highlighted by the Office of the Auditor General are various. One of the issues border around the issue of impunity. Impunity, that is the government agencies, for example, just know the law, know what should be done, but they are actually not doing it. And various projects have been highlighted, for example, the leasing of medical equipments. Then we have various issues to do with the privatization of agencies. And also, yes, so for one of the issues, for example, that have been highlighted that is, for example, that the project appraisals have not been done, for example, and some of the, for example, some of the water management institutions. So these institutions are awarded loans, and yet we do not have proper due diligence to ensure that these projects are able to service that loan that has been awarded. So when the loan is given to these institutions, and there are many, apart from the water companies, we also have regional development authorities. Yeah, so they're issued loans, they're supposed to service these loans, but they end up not end up not being able to service. Yeah, so that's a weakness. Then I would like to respond to the question by David. So David has observed that in terms of the revenue growth, it has been projected at around 1.7, the elasticity. So is asking whether this revenue, the global figure that is 2.8 ordinary revenue, is realistic or not. And from our point of view, we see that this revenue is overestimated. We are likely not to hit that revenue. The reason why I think this is the case is when you look at overall macroeconomic performance in terms of GDP, the growth is not very impressive. Yeah, while the overall growth is estimated to grow by 8%, the GDP growth is just about 4.8, the estimated. Yeah. So we also looked at buoyancy, that is the responsiveness in the revenue growth vis-a-vis GDP, and we saw that it was less than 1. So less than 1, it means that while GDP is growing by a larger margin, you not see expected revenue from that due to some of the leakages that we have also been seeing. Yeah. So what I mean, according to the Office of the Auditor General, big projects, for example, that consume a lot of money, PPPs, and even something like SGR, there ought to have been proper feasibility studies to ensure because out of these projects, then they will be estimating the revenues that will come out of that. So if they do a poor feasibility study, you'll find that they have overestimated revenue that ought to accrue from these projects, and then you find that it is missed because they did a poor feasibility study and project appraisals. Yeah. Yeah. So I would like just to refer to the Public Audit Act 2015, So the rule of law is very clear, and it has outlined some of the mandates that the various officers can do. For example, the Public Audit Act 2015, Section 64. It says where the Auditor General establishes that any person, supplier, or company has been involved in fraud or corrupt practice, the Auditor General shall report to the police or Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission or the Public Procurement and Oversight Authority for action. Then subsection 2, it says where the matter is referred to the Public Procurement and Oversight Authority, the Auditor General may make recommendation for debarment for future procurement. Debarment means if an officer has been found to be culpable, then he is barred from practicing as, let's say, procurement officer. So you have various provisions within the law, but I think the major impediment is the goodwill to act on these particular legal provisions. Yeah. Back to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Noah, for that, for those responses. Yeah, I think you've responded or answered a couple of questions. The one from David and I'm not sure where the other. I think one from Caroline. So yeah, Faith, you can pick a couple, particularly the ones in relation to debt question. Yeah.
Thank you, John. To answer Professor Rasa, the debt ceiling is set at 55% of GDP in net present value, and this is according to the PFM Amendment Act of 2023. I think Noah has sufficiently answered Caroline's question, so I would not. I'm not going to answer that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Faith. So we move on to Melody. I think the Melody, you've captured the ones on revenue.
Okay.
Yeah, one from Radha, but there is also one, you can also speak to the one, there's one that Anne Kemari has posted. Why do we not have full financials, actuals versus budgets for the previous year for revenue and expenditure? Yeah, maybe you can speak to that as well.
Okay, thanks, John. So in response to the question asked by David, I'll just give a little more input on what Noah has said. So since the revenue elasticity of 1.4 means that for 1% GDP growth, revenue is expected to increase by around 1.4%. So if we take a conservative GDP growth rate of 5%, holding all other factors constant, because we know there are a lot of shocks that can happen to the economy, particularly global shocks, drought and famine, and also internal shocks like what we saw last year with the Gen Z protests that adversely affected revenues. So if we hold all those factors constant, it means if we have a 5% GDP growth rate, then we expect a revenue growth of around 7%. And the projected estimates for 25-26 is 8%, meaning it's highly optimistic. And then on the other hand, we cannot look at revenue in isolation. We need to look at the basis from which this revenue is collected. Looking at income tax, we get the revenue from payee and corporate income tax. And as you've seen, the business environment has not been good for the private sector. And we've seen so many companies that are closing down. We've seen redundancies. Therefore, it means that if the economy continues as it is, then we may not get the targets for the income tax. When we look at VAT, which is a consumption tax, and looking at that with the lens of the disposable incomes and how households have been having reduced disposable incomes over time, then it means that households may not spend as they used to, meaning that the VAT that was collected previously may not be as much as the government expects to. So looking at the whole issue in totality, I think the government is overly optimistic on this issue, and it may not achieve the revenue targets that they have set in place. To answer Anne Kimari, we do not have the full financials because the 2024-25 financial year has not yet been complete. We are still in that current year. It will be completed at the end of 30th January. And the latest reports from National Treasury is up to the third quarter. So once we get the fourth quarter reports, which will be at the end of the financial year after June 30th, that's when we will have the full financials for the actuals versus budgets and for all the revenues and expenditure. Thanks. Back to you, John.
Melody, you meant 30th June, eh?
Yes.
Not January, eh?
Yes, thanks.
Anyway, thanks for that. Raphael, do you have any? There are a couple of, I think, questions also. I think there's one that Radha had asked about this comparison of comparison to other countries. Vietnam, Sri Lanka, etc. on the GDP, debt to GDP, and any other that you may want to respond to.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks for the question in terms of comparison. Computing the comparison in terms of how much we allocate to for Kenya compared to other countries. Kenya spends around 4% of GDP on education, and I have checked for Sri Lanka, for Vietnam. I think for Vietnam is around 2%, and then for Sri Lanka is around 2.5%. So in terms of I think Kenya, we are doing better in terms of allocating resources toward comparatively in terms of how much we allocate resources toward education compared to other country based on those two countries that have been cited. And then the second question by Anne Kamari: why do we not have full financial actuals and budget for previous years? Over the years, I have to say this, over the years, the Kenyan government, in terms of providing documentation for budget, I think we have improved compared to previous years. Why? Because if you check, for example, in terms of release of the Auditor General's report, by January this year, the report for 2023-2025 was actually out by January, meaning within a span of 6 months, you are able to access audited account from the Auditor General for all government institutions. Now, in terms of even accessing the actual figures for revenues and expenditure, the National Treasury normally releases the quarterly economic review paper, and that's somewhere we can be able to access the information. So for me, in terms of the government sharing out actual numbers in terms of what have been corrected and what have been spent, that one, I think that's something the government is actually doing fine at the moment. Yeah, I think those two, John.
Okay, thanks, Raphael.
John?
Yes, no?
Yeah, just I wanted to give some illustration to add on what the response by Melody to the question by David.
Okay.
Yeah, so yes, we think that the revenue is likely to fall short of the projected, and to what we've seen is that even when the government raises the tax rates, for example, on VAT, the collection is not really surpassing it's not really growing very much. To give an example is the VAT. When you look at the original estimates for VAT for last period, 2024-25, the government had projected to raise 812 billion. But then due to shortfalls, it is now projected just to raise about 669. Yeah, so there is a huge drop in that respect. And the effect of these shortfalls have resulted into several supplementary budgets. So in the previous period, we've had 2 supplementary budgets. And the minister, the CS for Treasury, is also intimating to have a third supplementary budget. So we've been having several supplementary budgets due to the shortfalls. And maybe just to add on the question by Caroline, why we have these supplementary budgets all the time. Some of these, yeah, so one of the issues is that the government has been making a lot of promises to the electorate. And so in trying to appease the electorate, we've been having a lot of expenditure towards some of these some of these areas which are not necessarily priority. For example, the housing project, and also the issue of CDF, for example, even in as much as it was declared unconstitutional, we could see that the government is still allocating more money. For example, in this year, 2025-26, the allocation is 58 billion for CDF. Then we have the Hustler Fund. Hustler Fund, you already, even before it was rolled out, almost everyone knew that this fund is not going to perform. And it has been recording losses because people are not honoring. So these are key issues that we see, and government goes ahead even when the CSOs and many people already point out the government is not ready to listen, want to just appease the electorate. Yeah. Back to you, John.
Okay, thanks Noah for that. Okay, so we now it's almost 12:30. We now have the final round, maybe for one burning question or two at most. Of course, I see one in the chat box from Jairus, which I will read out, but I will also want to give an opportunity for anyone the very final question from our participants. So maybe Noah, you can also capture this as you're preparing, you together with the rest as you prepare your final remarks. Jairus has posed a question, and what he says is that, as shown earlier in the presentation, economic growth has consistently been below targets, what you call shocks. What is your assessment of growth projections when you are starting the financial year still under tight monetary policy and therefore reduce private sector investment? So please take note of that. Do you have any other question from our participants? Okay. I don't see any other question, or so. Okay.
Let me ask now that somebody has not asked, is there anything that ISPAC can do? I'm looking at the context of LSK. LSK tries to do something on rule of law. Is there anything that ISPAC or the Institute of Economic Affairs can do to enforce rule of law in budget and financing? Because it seems our public agencies are completely overwhelmed.
Okay, thanks, Caroline, for that. I guess I'll also respond to that in my final as I conclude. But yeah, so thank you. So I guess that's it. So maybe let's start with Raphael. Your final remarks, Raphael, Faith, Melody, and then Noah. You can respond to Jairus's question and then make your final remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I think I don't have an answer to any of the questions that have been asked. But on my final remarks, I would say this. The existence of a government is to provide public service, to provide goods and services to, or public goods to its own people. And therefore, when we are talking about a wage bill, in terms of allowances, I think it's high time the Salaries and Remuneration Commission come up with a proper structure where they harmonize the issue of allowances, because definitely they will end up affecting our fiscal deficits each and every year. And therefore, it is high time as a country we start moving toward productive investments rather than focusing more on the consumption of the recurrent expenditure. So thanks, and yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Rafa. Who's next? Faith?
Thank you, John. I'll begin by mentioning some of the areas that my colleague had mentioned. I think it's Melody on budget credibility. And we've seen, we've done some analysis that shows that both spending and revenues are not realized as planned, and spending is not actualized as planned as well. And the analysis further shows that development spending is the most affected aspect. And to bring in the aspect of the increasing non-discretionary spending, we've seen that if it increases, there's obviously reduced fiscal space, and we don't have more funding for others discretionary spending, that like the other arms of the government, including the counties. And so this makes it difficult for the government to achieve some of the promises that they have made to us. For example, we've been implementing the fiscal consolidation since the mid-2010s, and up to now, we've never realized its a goal. We've seen annual increase in debt. For instance, as mentioned earlier, we've seen debt increasing to the tune of 1 trillion shillings, while repayment is at the same level, almost not at the same. We are paying interest at the interest payment is at 1 trillion and redemption is around 800 billion. So close to 2 trillion is set aside for debt repayment, meaning discretionary spending is non-discretionary spending is going to continue increasing over the years, and hence we might not even realize the fiscal consolidation agenda as planned. Thank you.
Okay, Melody.
Thanks. For my final remarks, I'll just echo what my colleagues have said. We might not realize the fiscal consolidation, looking at the actual numbers, the revenues, and also we've seen government has been a bit reluctant to reduce spending and also to implement austerity measures. So that will leave an environment where government will go back to more borrowing and increased fiscal deficit and then more borrowing, and therefore we'll be back to the cycle. So I think as they said that they are working towards fiscal consolidation, looking at the numbers critically, this may not happen in the 2025-26 financial year. Thank you all for tuning in and listening to us.
Thanks, Melody. Noah?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, so in my closing remarks, I would like us to just remember that in this
Noah,
in this budget.
please remember to answer Jairus's question, and then you can. Have you seen?
Yes. Yeah, we have some risks that may affect effective implementation of this budget. And these risks range from the high interest rates and also the foreign exchange shocks. Yeah. So while we have seen that there's some effort towards fiscal consolidation, but this is not enough. So when you look at the budget, including the redemption, it is 8.7% of GDP, which is very big. And the primary balance, that is when you subtract the interest rate, is at 3%, which is also very, very big. Now, this is likely to affect implementation of the budget because of the shortfalls in revenue, as Melody has said. So what we need is to pressure these institutions, for example, the central bank. So what central bank is doing is that it is reducing the central bank rate, which is the anchor for the interest rate, which is a good thing. So we think that the monetary policy is still tight. So currently it is 9. It was revised last week, and currently it is at 9.7%. 9.7% from around 14% last year. So we need to ensure that it's still low for the private sector to access the credit. So it needs even to reduce further down. Yeah. So what I'd also like to say is that we need to press the Auditor General to be releasing what is called the continuous audit reports. So continuous auditing of the government institutions will help the CSOs in terms of the being able to identify some of these issues, gaps in the implementation of the budget, and also now being able to elevate their voice towards demanding that action is done by the government. Yeah. So I think that is it from me. Back to you, John.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for those responses. I mean, just to add to what Noah has mentioned, yes, Caroline, there are certain questions with regard to the rule of law in when it comes to implementation of the budget. Of course, there are certain challenges when it comes to enforcement. So basically, what the IEA does is obviously point out some of these issues based on our analysis of public policy or analysis of the budget through our engagement with the policymakers. In some cases, we've actually partnered with other civil society organizations. So, for instance, where there are where we may require some litigation, of course, because that's not a part of our forte. Sometimes in the past we've actually partnered with those institutions that have expertise in that area. But mainly what we do is just obviously call out and increase pressure and advocacy where we have certain breaches of the law. But we've also partnered with other civil society organizations just to put pressure, but also just to educate them in terms of interacting with other documents, particularly the Auditor General's reports, as well as the reports by the Office of the Controller of Budget, who are the two independent institutions that often point out areas of breaches to the law. And in some of the things that they do is obviously undertake special audits. And of course, what Noah has just mentioned, the fact that we need that continuous audit is important. And often where we have gaps is in terms of follow-up in recommendation of the implementation of the recommendations that have been provided by the Office of the Auditor General's particularly from the part of the legislature. So I think there's need for more pressure on that side. But obviously, there are cases that have actually gone all the way to the judiciary, and we've also provided some content and analysis to institutions that have those expertise in terms of litigation. So yeah, so there are various avenues that we can follow as civil society organizations, whether in partnerships, in collaborations, to increasingly put pressure for action, especially where there are breaches of the law. So otherwise, thanks a lot to our presenters. So help me appreciate our speakers by, you can use the reaction button and just clap for them.